Okay, it's time we talk about the LCS. There are a couple of changes that we just found out about through this clip of LS. And so I'm going to play the clip, and then we're going to have to go through a whole lot of LCS history and all kinds of things to break down my opinions and takes on this. But there's a lot of news here about changes to the LCS and how things are going to work. So let's just let this play out first.
The main roster of Evil Geniuses, inspired as this level, Annie and JoJo. And if some of the other players had it on the team, one of the other things that I'll say about the EG roster implosion thing is, so something no one's talking about. There's no news articles or reports or anything from journalists about this. LCS teams have already begun contacting LCK teams in order to acquire a third import player without the intention of fielding them in summer for LCS or NA Academy. And the intention is to get either the already LCK player into a agreement that they will enter into contract with the LCS team following next year, or they've already approached LCK teams for their Academy or Challenger players to sign them for 2024. And literally just have them on contract and payroll. They won't do anything, and then they'll join the roster in 2024 when the 3 imports per team is allowed. And
wait, they're making 3 imports?
They're making 3 imports. So a lot of LCS teams have already begun doing that. What this means is that NA residents, like actual American players or, Canadians, whatever, OC players that declared NA residency, it's going to be so much harder now to get slots in LCS, because what I imagine is that I think it's really pushing closer and closer to 3 Koreans or 3 Chinese per team. And I think that's just the direction that teams are going to go. And I imagine that this upcoming season we'll start hearing reports of the LCS teams that have already begun doing this.
Do you think that's bad?
No, I don't think it's necessarily bad. Some players don't already know that certain LCS orgs have already made attempts to sign Korean players that will replace their current starter for next year.
I think that's bad.
And why is it bad?
Why is it bad?
I feel like I like seeing Americans on American teams.
Yeah,
okay,
but
that's cope.
I might as well. Why would I watch NALCS? I can just watch LCK at that point. Honestly, am I the only one thinking that?
Because I think LCS is kind of a mixture of yeah.
Region.
I think it's fucked. It's, But what I will say is that last year there was supposed to be the import rule lift, in which case we would have seen VCS flood LCS, but it didn't happen. The import rule lift that was supposed to happen last year was that all non-major regions would no longer count as an import for North America. And if that would have happened, VCS probably would have just flooded NA. VCS players like Levi, Doggo, who are other ones? Fofo, right? Is VCS is not major region player. There's so many players that would have probably just flooded NA because they would have been residents.
In my opinion, they should just merge the Americas like they do with Valorant, and that would be really big because there's some decent talent in Brazil too, and they have a shitload of viewers, and they have a shitload of viewers. The same thing.
Yes, I think the theory is that they want to do that, but the problem is that CBLOL might push back on it.
Why? I mean, I don't know I don't know as deep as that, but I think they should merge.
Yeah, I think they should merge
that'd
too.
be hype.
Yep. The issue, so the thing about this though is that California is a actually really bad place to have the LCS. Not only California state income tax, right? But there's so many other problems with certain teams. Not all teams have living covered. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So taxes, California state taxes, everything. I feel like if they merge CBLOL, they should move LCS to New York.
That ain't gonna happen, but
Why
Like,
not?
the more east, the better, no?
Because Riot's already there. It doesn't even. I don't think it even has to do about the teams. I think it has to do
Yeah, but
with like Riot's
Riot has
HQ and
sure,
their
but Riot has several
studio.
bases. They have Seattle. They have Berlin. They have Singapore, which is moving to become Riot HQ. Although I don't know if the Singapore thing is like known yet. They're trying to make Singapore like the mega hub, I think.
Oh yeah, then New York would be perfect.
Busio, you're
actually.
safe, man. Your support.
Thank you.
You're safe, man.
I was worried.
No,
Yeah,
Bussy is a
you're-
mid laner in my heart still.
Aw.
Another
go.
good man gone.
Busio's safe, dude. Top laners, mid laners, junglers, 80 carries, you're all fucked.
Facts.
And if what Travis Gafford reported is accurate too, that LCS orgs voted to abolish Academy, I think NA players in general are actually genuinely fucked.
Yeah, that part I
that
think is
sucks.
pretty alarming.
Huh?
I said that part I think is pretty alarming.
Yeah, if that
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot to address there, and we're going to kind of go through it all. But in order to kind of get back to these points that were made in the video, and I wanted to put them first because it's the reason why we're talking about all of this stuff, is adding a third import slot starting in 2024 for NALCS, that they were considering a worldwide minor region import rule lift for NA, meaning that any player from any minor region would be considered a native resident in NA, and combining the Americas with Brazil, Latin America North, Latin America South to create like a stronger major region that could maybe be on a more competitive basis with Europe, Korea, and China. And then the LA location or California location as kind of problematic as the place where the LCS is located because of income tax and the cost of living, since teams usually provide that to the players. And he mentioned there's a whole host of reasons. Another reason is ping, since the NA servers in Chicago, and then vote that that the teams took to potentially get rid of Academy. So we'll get there. But there's a whole lot that we have to go through before we can get there, of kind of some history of the LCS and a lot of problems that the LCS is facing that kind of tie into this. And so let's just get into that. To start with the history, the LCS used to have a promotion and a relegation system, and I'm going to briefly describe that system because I think it really helped, and it'll tie into a lot of these problems to get the history of where we got here with this import rule and all of these things. So back in the day, and LCS started in 2013, there was kind of like a big tournament to determine the original 8 teams that would be in the LCS. Now we have 10, right? And we had these 8 teams qualify. And the way the league worked at the time is you had these 8 professional teams, and then you also had a challenger series with 8 teams as well that completely mirrored the LCS. And the top 3 teams from the Challenger Series would play versus the bottom 3 teams from the LCS at the end of every split in a best of 5 series. And the team that won would promote into the LCS. That org would get into the LCS and replace that bottom team that they demoted. And that other team would demote to the Challenger Series. And so what it meant is that there was more competition back in the day when that system existed before franchising, because teams couldn't attempt to field just a low budget or a low effort roster knowing that they were franchised and that their spot was locked in. They had to put the best possible team together that they could, and it was a race because you didn't necessarily know what the other teams were going to look like and shape out to be, and so you didn't necessarily know whether the team that you put together, if you had like a middling budget or like a lower budget, or were trying to create a middling team, you didn't know if the middling team that you were trying to create, or the not so good team that you were trying to create, all of the sudden is the worst team in the LCS, and then you've doomed your entire organization forever. And so every team had to be as competitive as they could possibly be. It also meant that rather than having flex queue on, you know, the player side of things, we had ranked fives, where you had you could queue up as 5 people, but you had to have 5 people, and instead of an individual rank, you had a rank as a team. At the higher end of that, if you got into Challenger, the top 20 teams in Challenger were invited to a tournament every split, an open qualifier tournament, where they would play each other, and like 5 teams or something like that from that tournament made it into Challenger Series. So the Challenger Series League, that like Academy League, Challenger Series League, kind of like in baseball, it would be like the minor league, right? This minor league could constantly be inundated with new talent, new players coming straight off of the ladder who had either formed their own teams or new orgs that were trying to get in. And as a result, you had a vibrant community of amateur teams, 20, 30, 40 amateur teams that were all trying to get high up in ranked fives, all trying to get into these open qualifier tournaments, and all trying to play in Challenger Series to try to qualify for the LCS. Worst case scenario, it gave the players who were up and coming in the region great exposure, great team practice, and a tournament experience. And best case scenario, you actually got to see new players qualify for the LCS, and old, poorly run orgs just get kicked out. That system was replaced with the franchise system that each team paid $10 million to Riot for to get in, which also replaced, which was pretty controversial at the time, Team Immortals, which was a team that had done very well in the previous LCS splits and had a great roster, and by all means was organized pretty well. And that team didn't make it into franchising because Riot didn't like, we don't know exactly why, but Riot didn't like their essentially their business plan and their investment that they had behind them compared to other orgs. And so you saw a complete reversal where Riot went from a complete meritocracy where the best players and teams and natural born organizations could rise to the top and make it into the LCS, and where there was a clear path from literally your client and just playing the game to LCS as a team. And they replaced that with, hey, let's just collect $100 million from these 10 teams, and then, you know, and then we can do what we want because it's franchising. Now, before franchising happened, there was a team that came up, which we should touch on, called LMQ. And this is going to be really important for understanding why the import rule exists the way that it is, and some of the problems that should be addressed that aren't being addressed, especially by expanding the number of imports per team from 2 to 3. So LMQ was an all-Chinese team that was originally in the LPL. It was a sister team to Royal Club, and they came to NA. With basically the sole intention of competing in an easier league and then qualifying for Worlds through an NA spot. And you can see here that according to their history, right, they did manage to qualify for Worlds in 2014, taking a spot from NA at Worlds and giving it to a Chinese team, full Chinese team. And you can see the problems with this, right? A lot of people in the region hated this team, were actively rooting against them. It's very difficult to build a fan base if you don't speak English and you're in a region that speaks English. And so what do you end up with this situation where nobody's a fan of the team, nobody wants the team there, they're essentially hostile, coming in, taking over a spot from the region, and you get a lack of NA representation at Worlds, and the whole thing is just kind of ridiculous, isn't it? And so as a result, Riot decides to implement some rules to make sure that another LMQ doesn't happen. And so they implement import rules. And so the import rules here that get implemented require that you can only have 2 players that are imported from another region playing on a professional team in North America. So you say, okay, problem solved. We're not going to have a 5-man Chinese roster in NA ever again. Except they make some exceptions. So they have all these players who were playing in NA. And to be fair, a lot of these players on the list had been playing in NA for a while. There were good reasons why they were given exceptions. But you have this list of players who were initially grandfathered in, meaning that even though they were from EU or Korea or China or another region, they were given residency in NA because they had been in NA for a little while. You can even see Zhao Wei Zhao was given residency under this, who was the mid laner for LMQ. So Amazing, Bjergsen, Dexter, Helios, Keen, Crepo, Lus, Boyquas, Santorin, Seraph, Zhao Wei Zhao, and Chaox. All these players were given NA residency. Now, again, to be fair, some of these players maybe deserved it more than others. A lot of these players nowadays are retired or not playing anymore, so they're not really a big deal when we talk about putting teams together. But we also had exceptions for players who could earn residency through staying in NA for a while. And so if you lived, there are certain rules about if you live in NA and play in NA for a certain period of time, you become a resident and you gain that status. So you have players like Huhi, Someday, Arrow, Gamsu, Power of Evil, and Sven. I don't really understand what residency via IMP, or maybe that means import. I don't really understand what that means, but these were other players who were also essentially given some sort of, either through living there for a certain period of time or initially selected. I mean, these people weren't initially selected, but these people earned residency in NA as well. So you have Impact, Piglet, Jensen, Phoenix, Svenskar, and Huni, right? And so all these players were given this effective residency, right, in NA, on top of the fact that you can have 2 imported players per team. So then, even later on, we had a period of time a few years ago, not so long ago, where Oceania as a region actually lost their professional scene. The league ended up disbanding. And as a result, they were trying to figure out, what do we do with these professional players? Give me a second. What do we do with these professional players who are in Oceania, who are great players, but no longer have a league to play in? Well, we'll give them the option to declare NA residency, and then if these players want to play in NA, they'll also be given NA residency. So you have a ton of players, including Fudge and FBI, right, who are probably the most prominent of these guys, and some other ones like Lost. These players are playing in the LCS and they're given NA residency status even though they're not from NA. And so what you end up with is, even with the current system that we have, if you're building a roster, what you essentially want to think about is, how can I get one of these players, right, plus like 2 imported players, which you're allowed to have. So you're going to bring 2 players over from Korea, and you're going to get like 1 or 2 or even 3 of these players. And if you get 1 or 2 or even 3 of these players, then you can have a full team, just like LMQ, that's not from NA, even though NA is supposed to be for NA, right? And so what you end up with here is, well, how common is that? I mean, a lot of these players like are retired. So how common is it, that the teams are, how many players are we talking about here that are changing how teams are formed in NA? Well, let's take a look, and this is what really tipped things off for me, is noticing the rosters at last year's Worlds. because if you think about what Worlds and MSI are about, Worlds and MSI are about international competition, and the leagues themselves are about domestic competition. And so it's about seeing, you know, the best of the best in your region play against the best of a best from another region and seeing how your region stacks up.
You have 10 minutes to log in.
Sorry, we're locking in for Clash here. We're locking and loading. But listen, so Worlds 2022, I noticed, look at this, that if you look at the roster for 100 Thieves, Cloud9, and Evil Geniuses, excuse me, there are 2 Canadian players and 1 American player at Worlds last year. That's right, there was 1 American player at Worlds last year out of 15. So there's supposed to be 15 NA players at Worlds, and we get 2 Canadians and 1 NA player, right? And so what do we have? Okay, so 100 Thieves had Someday from Korea, Closer from Turkey, Abadage from EU, FBI from Oceania, and Huhi from Korea, right? Then on Cloud9, you've got Fudge from Oceania, Blabber's the only NA player to play in Worlds 2022, Jensen is from EU, Berserker is from Korea, and Sven is from EU, right? Also, by the way, we should highlight, right, some of these players. So FBI was given NA residency status because he was from Oceania. Someday was like grandfathered in or got residency status by living in NA for a certain amount of time. Same thing with Huhi from playing in NA for a certain amount of time. He was given residency status. And then, you know, Abadage and Closer don't matter because they can have 2 imports. You know, Blabber's the only American player. Fudge was given the Oceania opportunity to declare NA residency. Jensen's from EU, right? And he's, but he's also grandfathered in, I think, or got residency. Berserker's one of the imports. Sven may even have residency too, I don't remember. And then on Evil Geniuses, you have where do we go? How do we get to Travers Scafford? Impact, right, who's Korean but had doctored in residency, grandfathered in residency. For, you have Inspired. He might even have residency too. But he may be an import. And then Jojo Pune and Vulcan are both Canadian. And then Danny would have played, and he's American, but he had his issues, you know, personal issues during playoffs and stuff like that. And so we ended up with Kaori, who was considered an import from Turkey. So what you end up with is noticing that already with only an import roll of 2, even with an import rule of 2, you end up seeing only 3 NA players at Worlds. So it's quite a testament to how good of a strategy it is to build a team this way when the top 3 teams in NA only wind up with 3 NA players at Worlds out of 15. You would think that according to the rule, right, that you would end up with a minimum, right, of 3 per team, not 3 total. So you should see 9. But because of people who've got grandfathered in residency plus Oceanic players being added to that, you have so many people with NA residency that you end up going from 9 to 3. And you just don't really get to see what NA is doing at Worlds at all. And again, it comes back to what is the point of Worlds and MSI? The point of Worlds and MSI is not to see the best teams compete. Because if you wanted to see the best teams compete, you would have a qualifier and you would have like 8 teams from LCK and you'd have like 8 teams from LPL. You'd have like 3 teams from Europe and like 1 team from NA. And that would be the teams at Worlds. So there's a lot of people who maybe say that what Worlds is about is seeing the best teams compete, but you have to ask yourself, is that the Worlds you want to see, where there's 8 LCK teams and 8 LPL teams, right? And then, like, 3 European teams and 1 NA team? Because that's not how we structure Worlds at all. The way that we structure Worlds is to see all of the different regions compete versus each other. That's the way we structure it. So that's the point. So I would say that if that's the point, why is EU 99% or 90% EU players at Worlds? Korea is 100% Korean players. China is like 99% Chinese players. They have, in EU and China, there's a couple of Korean imports, but the teams are very predominantly either European or Chinese teams. NA is not the same. NA is filled with people from all kinds of different regions, and I'm not even talking about like people who have different backgrounds and stuff like that, but were born in NA. We're talking about just even players who grew up in NA. They're just not there, like Asian American or Asian Canadian or whatever or not. We're just seeing no native NA players at all at Worlds, and so we're not really getting a representation of how NA would do internationally at all, for better or for worse. And it would probably be for worse, but we'll get into that, right? Like, it doesn't matter though. What we want to see as NA fans and as a fan of the region is the team to be performing, and I think everybody wants to see the region performing as NA. So we'll get into that, but so let's talk about the import rule change. So changing it to 3 is going to make this even worse on even more rosters. You're going to see all teams utilize this for the most part, and so you're going to have another 10 NA players who are currently playing in LCS, like current professional players, who are going to be eliminated in favor of importing players from other regions, right? And it's going to make it all the more easy for teams to come up with 5 or 4 players who are not native NA players, which means, again, going back to the LMQ example, why not let a team like LMQ back in? What is the difference? Won't NA just end up becoming like an LCK Academy, like an LCK Challenger region as a whole, where we have teams that are multiple teams that are 4 or 5 Korean players or something like that? Team Liquid already did it, and this split, they didn't have a lot of success doing it, but that, I think, was for separate reasons. You can see that it's very easy to pick up 1 or 2 players from that list and then pick up the rest from imports, and all of a sudden you've got a technically an NA team that can take NA spots at Worlds that's got none or like 1 NA player on it. So there's some other problems that are kind of related to this as well. The LCS is also dying and facing a severe decline in viewership. And we have some data we can look at to talk about that and prove that. So here's the average hours watched going back to 2017. And what we can see is that the average hours watched in general, when we account for COVID, is just a straight decline. So what we see is 2017 to 2018 to 2019, the average hours watched declines. Now, what happens in 2020 and 2021? It pops back up for a little bit, but this is when everyone was at home because of COVID. Even companies, traditional companies like Netflix, that benefit from people watching more online content, saw a huge increase in revenue in 2019 and 2021 because there were a lot of people watching online content from home. Same thing happened to the LCS. The LCS viewership was very good in 2020 and 2021. But what we see is that, back to normal, in 2022, the LCS viewership drops even lower than it was when it was declining in 2019 to the lowest level it's ever been. When Riot said, and they've made all kinds of bad decisions that lead to this, right? When they said that the viewership times, right, were going to be, the broadcast time was totally fine, they're lying, right? Like, they chose to have LCS in the middle of the work week and to start it during the middle of the workday in order to clear the studio on the weekends for Valorant. they can pretend all that they want, that they think that that was fine, but clearly viewership has been declining for a long time, and changing the time definitely didn't help. Okay, so big viewership declines here in terms of total number of hours watched. So that's important, because if you're an advertiser, you know, the total number of hours watched and stuff like that is important as well. But we can look at some other metrics too. So for example, we can see that the average viewers in this is spring 2023 was about 100,000, 14 million hours watched, and peak viewers of 271,000. So let's go back and look at 2019. We can see that they had over 200,000 average viewers. $26 million hours watched, so rather than 14, so nearly double the average viewers, nearly double the number of hours watched, and about double the number of peak viewers. So we're seeing huge declines all across the board, right, since 2019 to 2023 in stats. So LCS has literally seen like a 50% viewership decline in the last like 3 or 4 years, right? It bumped up during COVID, as we would expect, but from 2019 pre-COVID to 2020 post-COVID, 2023 post-COVID, I mean, there's been a marked decline in LCS viewership. And so the question is, why is the LCS viewership bad? And do I think that this ties into the import requirement and NA, all these problems that we're seeing with NA in general? And I think it does. I don't think it's the main factor, but I think we can talk about some of the other things that are impacting the LCS viewership here. So let's take a look at some other things that are affecting it. So we know that there's a decline in LCS viewership. The number one thing I want to talk about is the broadcasting talent. And some of these were actually EU broadcasters, so I don't necessarily know, but this was back when things were more of a tournament format. Over the years, they have lost a lot of important talent in broadcasting. Some of the biggest names in esports. They lost Joe, D-Man, Doa, and Monte Cristo. And so let's just talk about why they lost these guys. These were some of the best casters, even in my memory, but just are considered some of the best casters in LCS history, EU LCS history, and they really lost Joe and D-Man because they moved the studio in EU to Berlin, and Doa was somebody that they ended up losing, kind of a prominent partner of Monte Cristo in casting, and they ended up losing him and Monte Cristo to Overwatch. And this is a video for another time. And I'm sure Monte Cristo has probably made his own videos about why he ended up departing from League of Legends. But there is a lot of controversy as to why Riot specifically fumbled the bag when it came to Monte Cristo being a caster for them, in terms of Riot wanting to underpay their talent. And he had an LCS team at one point, Renegades, that was, according to him, kind of unfairly forced to sell their LCS spot. So they were a team that actually qualified for the LCS through that Challenger Series promotion or relegation that we were talking about. And they had somebody leading the team who Riot had some problems with and felt like he was not handling things appropriately. Again, there's a whole lot of details there to get into, but Riot essentially forced Monte Cristo to sell his LCS team that qualified for the LCS and get out of that space. And he was felt that he was underpaid as a caster compared to what he could get in other leagues, and so he ended up moving on with Doa to Overwatch. Then some of your more popular NA casters, like Dash, obviously is a really huge NA caster. We unfortunately found out that for the first time in MSI's history, Dash is not going to be casting MSI, and he said in his tweet that he was devastated by this, and Riot didn't really give a clear reason as to why he wasn't hosting MSI. And I think everybody's pretty shocked and outraged about it. And then Freak, of course, is a little bit more of a controversial, whether people think that he's a great caster or not. But since I'm obviously like an old school viewer, I tend to look favorably on Freak, and he moved to the balance team and off of the cast. And so with that, right, obviously Riot has lost a lot of broadcasting talent over the years, and there's some other problems with the broadcasts. So another problem that I have with the broadcast, aside from the shift in talent to people who I just don't think do as good of a job as those other casters, the cast is, it's got so many problems going on. So these are going to sound contradictory. The biggest problem for me is that compared to the old cast, which felt like, authentic esports casts, in that they were very different and unique compared to sports. They weren't rigid. They weren't following a strict set of rules. They weren't trying to not offend anybody. They weren't not allowed to swear or any of this stuff. The casts were quintessential esports, and they were really hyped because of it, and they presented a different viewing package compared to watching traditional sports. Everything that the LCS has done is to just copy football and baseball and whatever, these big traditional sports, because they want to replicate the success that those sports have. But esports isn't the same. It doesn't have the same viewership. It doesn't have the same market. It doesn't have the same audience. It doesn't even have the same financial components as traditional sports do. And so it just shouldn't be shaped the same way as sports are. And so part of the problem I have with the broadcast now is that they're too serious, too professional, and they don't let loose in a way an esports event should be. On the other hand, and like I said, this might sound a little bit contradictory, and there's definitely arguments to be made on both sides here, the broadcast at times will try to do things that are more esports-esque, and they're failing miserably at them, and they're like kind of incredibly cringy and really bad. And I will say, so this last split of the LCS, they've tried a lot of stuff that's, especially after losing a lot of the broadcasting talent, huge cuts in their budget, they've tried a lot of new things. Some of it's worked really well and been quite funny, and some of it's gone pretty terribly. And I think that that's okay. It's fine for them to try new things and try to find their footing, and maybe it'll get better over time. But it's been hit or miss so far. So that's the broadcasting talent. But here's the thing. And maybe I should have done this in a little bit of a different order. I don't think that the broadcasting talent is the number one thing, or the way that the broadcast is formatted is the number one thing affecting the viewership. The number one thing that's actually affecting the viewership is straight up the population of the server. So I don't have old data on this, but you can go to op.gg and click on the leaderboard, and you can see how many people in each region. This will tie into something else too, so this is helpful. You can see how many people in each region have finished their placement games. And this is crucial because by seeing how many people in each region have finished their placement games, you're going to be able to understand both why NA is worse than Korea and EU in a reasonable, understandable way, and you're also going to understand why viewership isn't as high as it used to be. So this number, I can tell you from personal experience, used to be much higher, which means that there are just objectively less people playing ranked League of Legends in NA in 2023 than there used to be in the past. That's just objectively true. Okay, so this is a whole nother can of worms, probably for another video, but there are problems with the game. It's not retaining people for 20 years, 30 years like Riot maybe thought that it would. Things that have happened with the game in the way that it is right now, they're simply losing players faster than they're bringing in new players. And so they either need to change the game to bring old players back, or they need to change the game to bring new players in. And right now, they don't really seem to be doing either, because we're not going back to where we used to be in an attempt to drag old players back, which I think would be a mistake anyways. A lot of times, older players that have quit the game have just moved on into a different stage of their life, and they're not playing as much League of Legends anymore, or as many video games as they used to. And I think that that's a natural thing that will happen with any group of people playing and growing up with the game, and they'll just outgrow it. What you need to do is make it so that new players can enter the game. That's tough, because I think that the game is so overly complicated that with so many champions and stuff like that in it today, that I can see how difficult it is for a new player to learn the game, and it's impossible for somebody to want to get into it, because it's going to take them a very long time to learn everything about how the game works. It's just too much information. There's way too many champions in the game. It's way too complicated. And frankly, if you start removing content, then all of the players who, main those champions that you remove or anything drastic like that, they're going to get upset and leave. And that's going to be, way worse than any impact you would have by hopefully bringing in new players by simplifying the game. So it's really quite a rough situation there, right? So I don't exactly know what you would do to solve that, but clearly they're not bringing in enough new players, and they're bleeding a lot of old players. So that's number one. I think that you're seeing a pretty hefty decline in just in people playing the game in NA, and that's affecting the viewership. The broadcast is affecting the viewership. But, it being too serious and trying to mirror sports too much is affecting the viewership. And I also think that the imports, again, very small piece of this, are affecting the viewership as well. Just like that guy said who was talking with LS, why would I watch NALCS if it's just, I could just watch LCK if it's all Korean players or mostly Korean players, and keep in mind, worse Korean players than LCK, because LCK is also Korean players, but they're just better. So what we're talking about here is a situation where there's no incentive to watch NA. If you want to watch the best League of Legends, you're going to go watch LCK. If you want to watch NA League of Legends, yeah, you sort of watch NA, but there's not really even NA League of Legends in NA anymore. And so why watch NA at all? It's kind of a conundrum. And a lot of the reason why people watched NA in the beginning, or remember the old grassroots esports stuff I was talking about, how the feel of how it used to be, because you can relate to the players. You can imagine being on those teams. It seems fun. There's lots of content. You understand the history and the stories behind all of the players and stuff like that. Teams are constantly making vlogs and content. There's just not as good content about the players anymore. And part of the reason why the content about the players isn't as good is because some of the players can't speak English very well. It's very difficult to make content around them. Their story isn't necessarily relatable to an NA audience. And so it's just very difficult when you've got all these imported players from all over the world to make a team that can connect culturally, linguistically, and content-wise with the audience that you have in the NALCS. And so that's definitely had an impact. The not telling the stories, the not being able to create good quality team content on the players, it's definitely hurting the impact. Like, I'll tell you, as somebody who tries to follow the LCS, who probably knows more about the LCS than a lot of people, I have difficulty watching the LCS and following the LCS because I just don't know what's going on anymore with any of the players. And I think a lot of old players feel that way. And so not only do you have more older players moving away from the game, you also have more players who just can't be bothered to follow the LCS anymore because there's not any good content and we don't know who any of the people are, and they're in and out, and half of them are imported from another region and can't barely speak English. And so what is the point of following it in the first place, right? And even watching internationally if NA is not really even represented internationally. Okay, so to finally get back to the points that were brought up in the video, I think that they kind of, we watched them go through it, and they didn't. LS was curious as to why this other guy thought that it was a bad thing that they would do this. I agree with that guy. I think that it's a bad thing that they would add a third import. per team. I think it's going to result in 10 NA players from Canada and America getting kicked off of teams and replaced with Koreans and maybe some EU players and maybe some Chinese players. And I think that that's a shame because it means that NA is going to be even less represented internationally. It means there's going to be even less reason to watch players and relate to players and less storylines that make sense and are comprehensible. He also LS also mentioned that they were thinking about but didn't implement a worldwide minor region import rule removal where, like, you know, every minor region in the world could count as NA residents, and I think that that would be bad for the same reason. You'd grandfather in or give residency to all these additional players who would come and take NA player spots, and then NA wouldn't cease to exist as a region. You'd have all these other regions, and then you'd have like a multicultural mixed region. And that's interesting to see how like a mixed region would do versus all the other regions, but at the end of the day, it's not NA. And so it kind of makes sense that you have like a mixed, if you wanted something like that to see how it would do, you would, I don't know who would want that or like what would its natural fan base be, but if you wanted some like multicultural region to see how like players, hodgepodge of players from different regions did together, that could be its own separate region. But why take away NA in order to create that, right? And so that would have been a disaster. I'm really glad that didn't go through. Hopefully the third import slot change won't go through in the same way that this one ended up falling short, but it sounds like LS knows that that's the case and that teams are already looking for players. And he mentioned this, that they're going to contract players and pay them to sit on the bench in the summer split of 2023 so that they can start and replace their NA starting players as soon as 2024 starts. So that's just not good. As far as combining the Americas, they kind of all seem to agree that combining like all of the Americas would be good, and I don't necessarily think so either. I agree that by combining all the Americas, you would make a region that, like I said earlier, that would be more competitive with EU and Korea and China. Obviously, if you allow more players to come in from other regions, the region's going to be more competitive if you have more and better players playing. But I don't think that it's actually a good thing because of the same reasons I just said for all this other stuff. It's like, okay, so we're basically giving NA residency now to Brazil, Latin America North, and Latin America South, and so now we're combining all these regions as well into trying to create like a hodgepodge of minor regions plus NA into like a super region that can compete with Korea. And it's the same problem. You're going to get rid of NA players in favor of like a couple of Brazilian 80 carries and supports or something like that, and you're going to create a slightly more competitive region at the cost of NA's representation at Worlds. Now let's bring up another point, because maybe you're not a fan of NA or you're not an NA player or like an NA viewer. So think about it from this perspective. Let's say that you're an EU LCS fan or an LCK fan or an LPL fan or a Brazilian fan. Do you really want good players from your region? I'll give examples. If you're, LCK, do you want world champions like Someday and Impact going to NA instead of seeing how their careers would have developed had they played in your region and represented your region at Worlds again? If you're from EU, are you really okay with Bjergsen and Santorin and Jensen playing most of their entire careers in NA? Or would you have liked to see how those players did and what EU could have accomplished? EU may have won a world championship had Bjergsen and Jensen stayed in EU. We don't know. Does Brazil really want to see their top talented players? And this is why I think, they said, like, Brazil doesn't want to see the destruction of its region, and it has more viewership than NA. Why would Brazil want to see its best players come off to, go off to New York or something like that to play? Which, because they mentioned moving the studio, right? So it just doesn't make sense. So if NA viewers and players don't want this change to go through because it means less NA representation at Worlds. And EU fans and viewers don't want this change to go through because it means EU talent leaving EU and coming to play in NA instead of EU finally getting their best team together to win a championship or something. And LCK players and viewers don't want this. Who wants this? It's only the teams, and it doesn't even make sense financially because the import players are more expensive than native NA talent, and so the import players increasing the slot by one means that these teams who are facing budget crises and an esports recession right now are going to have to pay even more in 2024 to field a roster. So it doesn't make sense financially from the teams. And my best guess is that the teams are pushing for this because they think that winning internationally or putting a much better team together that's like better at the game will attract more viewership and fans. And the reality is that you can be LMQ and you can be the third best team in NA, and it won't get you any fans if you don't have any NA talent on your team. That's just the reality of the situation. People will actively root against you. Okay. The LA location. So this is another problem. One of the other reasons why NA is bad, and so I was going to show this, but we never switched to any of the other regions. So NA has 1,100,000 players who have completed their placement games. Now keep in mind, for every region, this is going to be less. There are actually less players than this because this also includes Smurf accounts. I have like 10 of these, right? So you go to Korea or something like that, and you can see in Korea there's 2,788,000 people. So there's a lot more people in Korea. In EU West there's 2,500,000, so pretty comparable to Korea, and even more when you go to EU Nordic East. So when you add EU Nordic East to EU, you've got like 1,100,000 here. So the EU's actually got more than Korea in EU West and EU Nordic East. China, we can't see. They have way more than everybody. They've got so many players on so many different servers, but their servers are kind of a different system, so we can't see. Oceania only has 100,000. But anyways, you get the idea. A region that, you think about it like high school sports or something like that. So if you don't know, if you've got a team, you think about it like the Olympics, if that helps. In high school sports, if you've got a high school that's got 2,000 kids going to it, and they're playing against a private high school that's got 300 kids going to it. The school with 2,000 kids, their top 10 most athletic kids that are playing, on the football team or whatever, or 11, right, are bigger and stronger and more athletic because they're picking from a pool of 2,000 people. The private school with 300 kids doesn't have as many high quality athletes, and so their top 11 players are kind of meh. Right? It's the same thing with esports, same thing with the Olympics. If you've got a country that's got a huge population, right, like the United States, like China, right, you're going to produce a lot of high quality athletes because out of the best people in the world at different sports, right, like number one is how many people you have, and like number two is going to be how big are your programs to develop and train these people. And the same thing applies here. NA is worse than Korea and EU, mostly because there's just less people playing League in NA. And so you would expect the top players to be worse because they have to make it through a pool that's significantly less people and less competitive. And so the top players are less good. And that's just the way that it is. I would rather, so yes, we would get weaker as a region if we, had less imports, but I would rather have NA talent represent NA at Worlds and MSI because of a lot of reasons. For one, if we win and we have 3 or 4 Korean players on the team, nobody is actually going to recognize that NA won a world championship. They're always going to look back at it and say, NA won because they had 4 Korean players. So Korea really won an extra world championship, and this one NA player won, while getting carried by 4 Korean players. That's the problem. And so if the point of the international tournament is to send the best teams to play, send 8 LCK teams and send, 7 or 8 LPL teams to Worlds, right? If the point is to see different regions compete and see how well they can do, then make NA a region for NA players, and let's see how NA stacks up at Worlds. That's the gist of it. Okay, so for the LA location, right? So one of the problems is ping, which they didn't talk about. The NA server used to be in LA, and that made sense, but had problems. So it made sense because for high-level players, for professional players, and for aspiring professional players, they were located in California, on challenger teams that were living in California, on LCS teams that were in California. And so when they practiced in solo queue, they could practice in a low ping environment. But the problem with this is having the server on the west coast of NA doesn't make sense, because not having it in a central spot means that you were going to have a lot of players on the East Coast who are playing on like 100, 120 ping, while West Coast players are playing on like 8 to 20, and that's not fair, and it means that the game is kind of inaccessible for the most part to a huge portion of the country and what could be a big player base. So they moved the server for solo queue from LA to Chicago, but now the teams are still located in LA. So that means when they're practicing on the tournament realm, and this is the only region like this, when they're practicing on the tournament realm, they're practicing on LAN ping. They're practicing on 4 to 8 ping or whatever, like very low ping, maybe even lower than that. They're practicing on very low ping. But when they're playing solo queue, they're playing to Chicago and they're playing on 60 ping. So is it any wonder people call NA pros lazy for not playing solo queue? They're not playing solo queue because if they're playing on the tournament realm, they can be playing on 8 ping and practicing like they would in a stage environment. And if they're playing solo queue, they're going to be practicing, in a complete garbage 60 ping environment. And by the way, if you don't understand how big of a thing this is, because I didn't really get how big of a thing this was, I went from playing in Seattle when the server was in LA. And so when I was playing in Seattle and the server was in LA, I had 20 ping. And then they moved the server to Chicago and my ping went from 20 to 60. And then I moved to college to near Chicago and I ended up going down to like 12 ping. And then I moved again and got fiber, and now my ping is 4 ping. And so I know from 4 ping what 4 ping feels like, what 12 ping feels like, what 20 ping feels like, what 60 ping feels like. Let me tell you how big of an impact this makes. If you're thinking about playing professionally, you should legitimately move to wouldn't recommend moving to Chicago, but you should move as close as you can to the server. Because the difference between playing on 4 ping and playing on 60 ping, it's a completely different game. And what I mean by that is literally it's a different game, because you memorize how different matchups are going to go and whether this counters this based on a lot of cases, little things like Janna Tornado will, you can Q on Janna and like cancel a Leona's E every time or something like that. Now that's one you should probably be able to get even on higher ping. But the point is that you'll have interactions like that, and in a lot of matchups, it'll come down to ping. Like on 4 ping, I'm always going to be able to, Nautilus hook a Recon W to prevent it from going off, right? And on 60 ping, I could never, right? And that completely changes whether Nautilus is good into Recon versus whether Nautilus is terrible into Recon. And that makes a big difference, because you're learning the game completely wrong, and what you're capable of doing is completely wrong. And we're just talking about support. So this is the same thing in top lane matchups with abilities that counter each other if you time it correctly. On certain highly mechanical champions like AD carry, like on Lee Sin and Nidalee in the jungle, it completely changes the game for you. So not only are NA players held back because there are less people in the region, making it less competitive, but they're also held back because the solo queue environment sucks because there's high ping, which is the only region that has this problem where the studio's not located where the server is. And there's not really a good way to fix that. So it's a disastrous situation. And then I agree, of course, that like for the players and for the orgs and stuff like that, that tax in California is ridiculous. And the living cost is very expensive there. So if the team is, attempting to buy a team house and it costs $3 million or something like that, that's kind of a problem compared to if they were somewhere where cost of living was more reasonable and taxes were better. And then this is the final thing is that actually they mentioned that the system that we currently have is, it's not called Academy anymore, it's called NA Challenger League, but that the LCS teams actually behind the scenes voted to that they would be okay with like getting rid of their challenger teams, right, as a way to save money during this esports recession and stuff like that. Getting rid of their responsibility to field challenger rosters would be great for them because they wouldn't have to bear the expense of rostering and contracting 5 other players or more if they have subs, and paying like a coaching staff and analyst and other people to help support that team. And so they could save a lot of money by doing that. And it wouldn't really affect anything in terms of their viewership or fan base or any of the ways that they make money. And so it would be a huge cost savings to them. And Riot may actually consider it with the problems that the league is facing. And it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. From my perspective, if you keep the Challenger League, but you bring it back, even without promotion or relegation into the LCS, you bring it back, and Riot's been doing some of this, which we'll talk about too. If you bring it back more like the Challenger series was, where it's all amateur teams and there's like not really any LCS teams involved, it could be fine, because I think amateur orgs in NA will naturally step up and fill the void if the Challenger League becomes open to them. And I think that they'd run it without the teams running it. I think that would happen. So it'd be fine, but if they drop it and then Riot doesn't provide any more support for the Challenger League, it could be a huge disaster. So if the LCS teams want out of it and then Riot decides, okay, no more Challenger League at all, we're just going to have the LCS and there's going to be no amateur league at all, no minor league, no up-and-coming league, no nothing, not even to showcase talent, not even to help new players get team experience and practice and stuff like that. If that goes away completely, that will be a huge disaster for NA, because then not only will we have all these other host of problems, but we will also not even have the ability to develop new players that are up and coming for the LCS. So I will say one piece of good news is Riot actually created a new system, which I'm working with. They created a new system for the NA Challenger League, where rather than just the 10 academy teams that there used to be, there are 10 challenger teams owned by the LCS teams. They're minor teams, and there are 6 spots available to completely random amateur orgs, and those 6 orgs qualified, and then there is an open qualifier which they've brought back, and promotion and relegation, but just for that academy or challenger league, not for the LCS, but just for the challenger league. What that allows is the bottom 4 teams from those 6, I believe it's the bottom 4 teams from those 6 random orgs. I don't think any of the like LCS teams, challenger teams can get relegated, but it's like the bottom 4 teams of those 6 amateur teams at the end of every split will have to play promotion and relegation versus the top 4 teams from a series of 2 open qualifier tournaments, and you get points for finishing, like top 4 whatever in those tournaments. You get points at the end of both of those tournaments. The teams with the most points will play in those matches, and so there is some room that Riot's created for now. You can have amateur teams again competing for something and helping develop NA players and showcasing their talent. And even though these are just spots in the Academy League, there have been like 30 amateur orgs that have popped up to support and help train and coach some of these players, and it's been great. If Riot scraps all of that, that would be a huge disaster. So I hope that if Riot does get rid of the responsibility for LCS teams to have a challenger team. Just bring the challenger league to 10 or 16 teams, all amateur teams for that. And so then you still have academy. It's just all run by amateur orgs. That way there's still at least some support for showcasing and developing NA talent. The other thing is, with all of these problems, this is kind of a crazy thought, but I do wonder if there is not a market, since everybody's allowed to broadcast the game. If NA is seriously going to go to 4 or 5 Korean or imported players per team, I wonder if there's not a market for somebody to actually start a competitive league, like how the NFL has the NFL, and then there's, like, in football there are other leagues like the XFL and like other football leagues that are not associated with the NFL that are competing with them. I wonder if there'd be an opportunity to do something like that with League in North America, because I think there are a lot of people who want to watch NA esports and want to see NA teams compete, and right now we're not getting any of that at all. And so if next year all of the teams are 4 or 5 Korean players per team, because they're allowed 3 imported players, and then there's going to be like all these, you know, all these imported players from EU and Oceania and Korea that are that have residency status, you may actually see like an all American and Canadian league gain viability to compete with the LCS. I think if they did a good job of telling a compelling story for the players and bringing new people into the fold and get 10 solid orgs to be a part of it, and you know, and tell the story of those players and bring in some of the old broadcasting crews and stuff like that, or some new broadcasting talent that's doing a tremendous job, or that maybe is even better than the talent Riot currently has after all their budget cuts. You could maybe see a league emerge in NA that's even competitive with Riot's own league. So, you know, that's really all I have to say about it. Be interesting to see, because I think in the video LS didn't really get into it too much, and there's definitely a debate to be had here about all of these things. So it's interesting to hear what people think and what people have to say about that. But I'm definitely in favor of more NA pros getting to play in NA, and us getting to see what NA, you know, can actually do at Worlds. It might be interesting too, since I haven't really dived into it pre-2022. I wonder if we go to previous Worlds, right, how much NA representation there was at Worlds. You know, was this something that happened the year before too, and we just didn't notice? You know, in 2021, how many NA players were actually playing at Worlds? So interesting questions to get into, and hopefully Riot can fix the game. GG.